we're in the 8th chapter of the book of Esther, and we're going to be talking about God's victory over hatred. Even though the bad guy is defeated, Haman has been killed by the king, there is still hatred in the nation against the Jews. And God is going to take action on the Jews' behalf as we get into chapter 8. And we're going to look at this today, that God is the source of victory, even when we can barely see it happening. We'll talk about that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. This is an example of a real Bible study between friends. I'm here with my friend Sherry Mangrum, and we're doing a real Bible study. This is to help you see how to study, mark, and apply the scriptures to your life. And today we're in the 8th chapter of Esther. If we remember the 7th chapter, it ended with the execution of the bad guy. Haman is executed by the king for his plot against Esther and against Esther's people and against Mordecai. So we would say, really, that's the end of the story. That's the climax of the story of hateful Haman, who hated God's people. He didn't know about Esther yet. But so we see that as finished in the 7th chapter. So you've read the 8th chapter. Let me ask you the question, why is the 8th chapter there? What is God trying to communicate to us during the 8th chapter?
You have to right the wrong that's been done.
Okay, even though Haman is dead, there's still some work that has to be done.
That's
And
right.
God has to help in the just so happens department that we've seen all through the book and finish a problem, because the Jews are facing a problem still. Now, Esther is not aware of this problem. Now, she knows that the Jews are under a death sentence, right? That was from earlier. We just discussed this day there was going to be open season on the Jews, that Haman had written that and tricked the king into doing that. But here's a problem. In those days, once a king had a proclamation, it could not be rescinded.
Law.
It was law. And we see that even in the book of Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar was tricked into a death sentence for Daniel for praying, remember?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he said, oh man, I have no choice but to put Daniel into the lion's den, because this edict is an edict of the king and that can't be changed.
And it goes so far as to even say he was grieved to have to put him in. He couldn't sleep that night.
Now,
he was very upset.
Now, Ahasuerus is going to face the same kind of a thing. Haman had tricked him into this proclamation that he was not even aware of the details. He knew there was a people that were disobeying, and Haman had falsified that. And then he had, under the king's name, done this proclamation. So we're going to see this unfold as we go here. So let's take a look at this. Read down to verse 3.
On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot which he had devised against the Jews.
Okay, so we would say, listen, the payoff is Mordecai is safe, Esther is safe. The king has rewarded them for being in danger. He's elevated Mordecai to a high position in the court and given Mordecai his signet ring. Now, he had given that signet ring to Haman, and we're going to talk more about the signet ring in a minute, but he had given that. Now,
And that parallels Daniel.
Sure, it shows that God has saved them and there is a reward for coming through the test without losing their temper and without being angry at God and without being angry even at the king.
And that's even in Revelation. The seals are sealed with a signet ring.
Oh yeah, the signet ring, we're going to talk about that in a few verses.
Okay.
Signet ring becomes very important here, and we're going to look at that. But so Esther still has some business to do with the king, and she implores him, and she is after him to avert the evil scheme. I underline that because she wants the evil scheme of Haman to be averted. But there's a problem, and we're going to see that as we go here. Now, the king, in verse 4, shows his favor. He extends the golden scepter. This is the second time he's done that to Esther and showing his favor. And so Esther arose and stood before the king. So she's up off of her knees begging and weeping, and she stands before the king. And then she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Haggagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces." It was obvious that Esther did not understand the administration, the way the laws of Persia worked. Being a Jewess, she really did not have, as the royal wife, she did not have an education on how the laws worked, because she wants him to revoke that proclamation against the Jews that Haman had made in his name. It shows here that she has a desire for something that just can't happen. And we're going to see that as we go. Let's go back to the word here. And she's begging for the Jews. And she says, verse 6, "How can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people? And how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred, all my nation?" So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, he's called that throughout the whole book, "Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he has stretched out his hands against the Jews." I could do that.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So he says, I gave Haman the death penalty, and I gave Haman's wealth to Esther. And he says, now you write to the Jews. Now, here's what the king's got in mind. I really like King Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. He's a measured man. Even though he's angry, he goes off and gets counsel. He's angry and he walks off and cools off before he comes back and does something that would be stupid in his anger. So here he says, now you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name. Now this is very similar to what he told Haman. He says, and seal it with the king's signet ring. So Mordecai has the signet ring, and here's where we see that show up. This is a way of it becoming an official document of the king, right? And he says, okay, send this decree. He says, you got to write a letter, because the letters that the king writes cannot be revoked. You see where he says that? Is for a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. And so she goes, oh, wow. So this letter to destroy the Jews cannot be revoked? And Ahasuerus says, yeah, that's right. But I got a plan. You write another letter in my name. So this is not a revoking of the first law. This is putting a spin on it that's going to be to the benefit of the Jewish people. He says, so the king's scribes.
Wouldn't this be an addendum?
No, it's got to be, there's no addendums to the law. There's no changing this law that says there's an open season on the Jews.
Okay.
That's set in concrete. They can't revoke it. They can't add to it. All they can do is do another law that has a benefit to the Jews in it. And we're going to see that. And so the king calls his scribes. Now, the reason the scribes was necessary, Mordecai is going to write the letter, but the letter has to be translated into all the languages of the kingdom. And he says that.
Okay.
So the scribes were called at that time in the third month, that is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the provinces so every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language. That's why you needed the scribes. Okay? So the scribes write out this command. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. So now this is again an official document of the kingdom, the court. This is a proclamation the king is making. It's being made in his name with that signet ring. And it was being sent by couriers riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. So this is the best horses that could be supplied.
Yes.
So now the mystery is, well, what's going to be this in this letter? So let me switch here to the rest of the chapter. Because here we're going to see God's provision and God's grace to them. He basically says, wait a minute, you are delivered from Haman. Haman's dead, and I gave you his mansion, I gave you his wealth, and I've taken care of Mordecai by getting him the signet ring and giving him a station in the kingdom. But then she says, but I've got to ask you for my people.
That was that was part of her petition to begin with anyway.
Now, what's interesting about that, when she says, I need to beg you for my people, which Haman wrote this terrible letter. She doesn't blame Ahasuerus. She doesn't say the letter that you wrote, the proclamation you did. She says the proclamation that Haman did in your name. But this was a surprise. The Jews were being singled out. Remember, we talked about that last week. So now we're going to get into the rest of this, where he's really expanding this idea, because the king has got a problem. The proclamation to destroy the Jews has been made, and it was an official proclamation. And the king says to Esther, that can't be revoked. And so at that moment, Esther's heart kind of goes, oh man, so you can protect me and you can protect Mordecai because we're protected by the court, but my people are still in danger. And Ahasuerus says, yeah, the proclamation can't be changed, but I got an idea. And we're going to see that here as we go. Here is the king's idea. He says, in them, the letters, which the scribes have now transported all over the kingdom, the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives. So he says, there's this proclamation against you, but now I'm giving you permission to get an army together, assemble, and defend your lives against people from the first edict. To defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which may attack them, including children and women, and you get to have their spoils.
And which is the exact same words that the wicked Haman used against the Jews.
Exactly. So he says, I can't change that they have permission to attack you, but I can change the fact that you now have permission to retaliate if they attack you.
And it's on the same exact day that the wicked Haman put out. It's on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar.
It's really two different laws. One says, hey, you're free to attack the Jews. But there's another law you need to be aware of that says if you do, they have every right to defend themselves, even to the point of annihilating you and taking your possessions. So Haman is gone, but there are those still in the kingdom who hate the Jews. What we would call today anti-Semitic people that are just hateful of who the Jews are. And that's through all the provinces. if they attack you. Now, this isn't a right to attack people just out of the blue. He says only in defense, to defend your lives. And he says, in one day, in all the provinces of the king of Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, a copy of the edict will be issued as law in each and every province, and it was published to all the people so that the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So if they were attacked, they could defend themselves and avenge themselves. And the couriers hastened, verse 14, and impelled by the king's command, they went out riding on the royal steeds, and the decree was given out at the citadel in Susa, the capital. So it's everywhere in the kingdom, including the capital. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. So now we don't have Haman, who's vindictive. We have a godly guy named Mordecai, who is in this high position. And he says, they rejoiced for the Jews. There was light and gladness and joy and honor in each and every province, in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived. There was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday, and many among the people of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. So they said, if I can't beat them, I'm going to join them. And so they said, now, this holiday, we're going to talk about this feast and holiday next week. And we're going to look at that in chapter 9, where the Feast of Purim. And we're going to talk about that and what that meant and how that's even celebrated today. And we're going to do that. But this chapter really shows God's ability to protect his people and protect us against hatred, even when it looks impossible. There was this law that couldn't be broken. Esther wanted it revoked, and the king said it can't be revoked. But the king, being wise and in love with Esther, and really humiliated that he had been manipulated by Haman, allows a new law that's not a superseding law, but it's a co-law that says, oh, if you're going to obey that other law and attack the Jews, they have permission to defend themselves. That God really shows a victory for the Jews, one that they celebrated. And we're going to see that work itself out in chapter 9 next week. Okay? Any observations about chapter 8? Do you see where it just so happens that God is at work through Ahasuerus, who was manipulated in an earlier chapter to have this proclamation that couldn't be revoked. And now God is using that same king, Ahasuerus, to give victory over hatred to his people.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It has a feeling of the Jacob story.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of parallelism to the Jacob story.
Yeah, and the Daniel story.
And the Daniel story, yeah.
The theme through the Old Testament is, if God's people are faithful, even through trials, even through the title for the book of Esther that I chose was Faith in the Face of Hatred. If you maintain that faith, God will show up and he'll give victory over hatred if you just let him work. And God will use the circumstances. We're going to see that. And we'll finish this out next week with chapter 9 and 10.
Sounds great to me.
Today we've been talking about victory, the victory that God brings, the victory over circumstances that look lost, that look overwhelming. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called God is Active in All Things. It's out of the book of Romans. I think you'll enjoy it and it'll be a blessing to you. And listen, we're going to continue our study and finish up Esther next week. And until then, God bless you.